A few weeks ago, Britton and I, we went on vacation, and we wanted to get away from the cold of January. Anybody who would like to get away from the cold of January? Yeah. And we decided that we wanted to get away from the winter blues, and so we flew down to Phoenix for a week. And while we were down there, Britton had arranged all of these hikes that we were going to go on. And what you need to know about me is I'm not a hiker. That's not something that I enjoy doing. And so I was like, okay, honey, we'll do whatever you want to do on this vacation. And one of the hikes that she had planned for us was to go up this mountain in the middle of Scottsdale, Arizona called Camelback. And some of you have maybe done this. And this is a trail that takes about 3 hours to go up, and it climbs 1,500 feet in elevation. We would like to take the hard things right off the bat. That's just kind of who we are, right? And we started out on this trail, and it wasn't too bad, and we got down the trail a little while, and it was like the trail just kind of disappeared. Or it seemed to go in multiple directions, and we weren't quite sure which way to go. We actually started going a little bit off the trail, and then somebody came walking past us. I'm like, oh, that's the way. Let's follow them, right? Because a guy doesn't ask for directions ever, right? Not even on a trail that he never been on before. Another part of the trail, we got a little bit further along, and we came to this rock face. It was like a 60-degree incline of solid rock, 12 feet high, and it was like, okay, there's no way around it. I don't think I can go up it, so where does the trail go to? Have you ever gone hiking like that and suddenly the trail just seems to divide and you're not sure which way to go, or maybe the trail disappears and you're not sure which way to go, or you get slammed up against this rock and it's like, now what do we do? Where do we go from here? And sometimes hiking's a lot like life, isn't it? That sometimes the trail that you thought you were on suddenly disappears. Sometimes the trail that you're on seems to split and you don't know which way to go. Sometimes there's a rock right in front of you and you don't know how to get over it. And when we were hiking this trail down in Phoenix, the park rangers had been nice enough to mark the trail for us. They had gone along, so when the trail just kind of disappeared, there were little markers that if we looked around carefully enough, that we would find our way back onto where the trail was and where it was heading. And when we came to that rock face in the 60-degree incline, they'd actually marked handholds and footholds that would help us get up and over the rock. And that's a lot like life too, that there are trail markers to finding our way through life. And last week we started this series called The Greater Than, or Greater Than. And this series is all based around something that Jesus said in John 14, verse 12. It's a really challenging thing that Jesus said. Jesus said, very truly, I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and even greater things than these, because I am going to be with the Father. And I don't know about you, but I find this to be a very challenging verse. Because as I read it, I can't help but compare Jesus' life, the things that he did, because he said we would do the things that he did, and even greater things. And I compare that to my life, and I wonder, is my life greater than or less than what I see Jesus doing? And the question that we often ask as we pursue this greater than life that we started talking about last week is we begin to wonder, am I on the right path? Am I headed the right direction when it comes to experiencing this greater than life that Jesus invites us into? And this morning, in the time we have together, I want to talk about what the trail looks like, where the trail leads, and look at some paths, some trail markers that will help you know if you're on the right path towards the greater than life. I want us to be able to answer today at the end of our time together, yes, I know that I'm on the greater than path, or this is what I need to do to get back on that path today. If you have your Bibles, turn with me to the book of John. We're going through the book of John between now and Easter, and the book of John was written by a guy named John. How fitting, right? It's written by a guy named John, but it's not about John, it's actually about Jesus. And John was one of Jesus' closest friends. He actually refers to himself in the book as the disciple whom Jesus loved. It meant they were like best friends. They had a close relationship. And John was there when Jesus did these things. He was there when Jesus spoke those hard words in John 14:12. And he was there as we read this passage that we're going to read today. And he had the presence of mind to sit down at some point in his life and just write down everything that he could remember about Jesus' life. Well, not everything, but as much as he could. He said, if I were to write down everything that I saw or everything that Jesus did, it would fill all the libraries in the world. So he has specific things that he writes about, that he talks about, in order to help us experience the life that Jesus envisions for us. That's what he says at the end of his book. He says, I wrote this so that you would come to believe in who Jesus is, and so that you would discover the life that he has for you. And so we need to keep this in mind, that John is writing with a purpose. He doesn't tell us everything. He tells us the things that keep us on the path to the greater than life that Jesus envisions for us. Follow along as I beginning at John chapter 4. We're going to start at verse 46. It says this: Once more he visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned the water into wine. Jesus is back in Cana. Last week we were in Cana. We were at a wedding feast in the village of Cana. And Jesus was there with his mom and his disciples. And do you remember what happened? They ran out of wine. And Jesus turns water into wine. And John says this is the first miracle that was done in Cana. And now John starts this section off by saying, hey, we're back in Cana. And he actually ends this passage by saying this is the second miracle that was done in the village of Cana. And John does this because he wants us to pay attention to what happens between Jesus' time in Cana. In between, what's happened is that Jesus went from Cana and he went down to Jerusalem. It was Passover time, which is a religious celebration where all the men and some of the women would travel down to Jerusalem to worship at the temple. And Jesus went down there, and we're told that Jesus did a bunch of miracles and he began teaching people. And the people of Jerusalem really struggled to understand who Jesus was and what these miracles or these signs and wonders that he did actually meant. And then we're told that Jesus met with a religious leader who had seen everything that Jesus was doing, and he had questions, that he wondered who Jesus was. Who was this guy that was doing these incredible things? And so a guy by the Nicodemus comes under the cover of night because he's ashamed to be seen with Jesus during the day. And he meets with Jesus under the cover of night and asks question and leaves wondering who this Jesus really is. And then Jesus goes out into the Judean countryside, into the country around Jerusalem, and he begins teaching and doing the same thing again, miracles and teaching always combined together. And we're told that some people believe, enough that some of the disciples begin baptizing people into the way or the lifestyle of Jesus Christ. But most people don't believe. And then Jesus travels to Samaria. It actually says that he had to travel through Samaria. Now, maybe you know this, maybe you don't know this, but Samaria was a place that Jews didn't really go. You know, if you watch Corner Gas, you ever watch Corner Gas? Anybody watch that? A few of you? Yeah, and they talk about Woolerton. What do, right? That's right. I won't do that on the stage. I'd have to clean it up afterwards, right? But they kind of like spit whenever they mention Woolerton. That would be Samaria, okay? That would be Samaria in this situation in the first century, and Jesus says he has to go there. And so he goes to this village and he meets this woman and he starts talking with her about who he is and what she needs in life. And she comes to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. But not only that, she runs back to her village and she tells everybody in the village, and the village comes pouring out to meet who Jesus is, and Jesus stays there, and many people in that village come to know Jesus. And now we are up to date with our passage that we're starting, where John says that Jesus is back in Cana, where he turned water into wine. And it says this: and there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum. And when this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son who was close to death. Well, we don't know who this religious or this royal official was. All we know is that he was desperate. So desperate that he comes from Capernaum to Cana. Capernaum, to put it into a perspective of what it would be today, if you were to start walking from here and walk out to Lumsden, that's how far he walked in order to be in the presence of Jesus. A whole day's walk. But it's not prairie land where it's flat, right? This is Capernaum, which is 600 feet below sea level, to Cana, which is 300 feet below sea level to 600 feet above sea level. 900-foot elevation difference, something like what I walked going up Camelback. And that's how desperate the man is. This is a man who is a royal official. He's used to having people come to him. He's used to giving commands. He's used to summoning people to be in his presence. But he is so desperate that he leaves the bedside of his son who's dying in order to be in the presence of Jesus, because he's heard something about Jesus and he has to go and find him. The man is desperate. And he comes to Jesus, it says, and he begins to beg. Imagine a royal official begging There's probably a crowd around Jesus, because we're told wherever Jesus went, there was a crowd so big that actually at one point, he couldn't enter into villages because there was so many people following him. And so he comes, and he's a royal official in Herod's court. Herod, who rules the region of Galilee, Herod Antipas. And people would know who he is. And yet he's so desperate, he begs Jesus to heal his son. And Jesus says, unless you people see signs and wonders, you will never believe. Does that sound harsh to you? Does that sound like, that's not a very nice response? It's not the response you would expect from me if you came up and told me that your son was dying. You wouldn't want that response from me, would you? Last week I said this, I said that Jesus never rebukes those who come to him for help. Yet this seems to be a rebuke, doesn't it? And in order to understand what's going on, we have to look at what's gone on right before. You see, whenever we come across something that we don't like Jesus saying, or it sounds really harsh what he's saying, we should always ask the question, why is he saying this? Why does Jesus respond to this man in this way? And Jesus says, unless you people see signs and wonders. And we have to understand, in order to understand why Jesus says this, we have to understand who this comment is addressed at. And it is focused at the man, but it's greater than that. It's focused at the crowd that's around him. And in order to really understand who Jesus is talking to and why he says this, we have to go back up a few verses. We started at verse 46, but the passage starts at verse 43. And John, the author, has this introduction that goes in verse 43, 44, 45, in which he says that Jesus came to Cana, and then he made this statement. In verse 44, John says, now Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet has no honor in his own country. And then he follows that by saying when Jesus arrived in Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him. It's kind of interesting that John puts this together, because he says that Jesus said a prophet is without honor, and then immediately afterwards John says, well, he's welcomed in Galilee. And it seems to be a contradiction of what's going on, but what John is doing is he's trying to point us back to what's happened between, remember I said Cana is bookends of this section of John? And John wants us to look at what's going on between the two bookends. That Jesus was in Jerusalem, where he did signs and wonders and people didn't come to believe. That Jesus was in Judea and did signs and wonders and people didn't come to believe. And Jesus is in Galilee, and it says this, it says, they had seen him, all the Galileans had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the Passover festival. So the Galileans who are welcoming him to Cana are people that had been in Jerusalem and seen signs and wonders. And they welcome him not because they believe he is the Messiah, but because they want more signs and wonders done around them. And the people, or the country that Jesus says is not receiving him, are the people of Jerusalem, Judea, and Galilee. What we would refer to as Israel. And Jesus says, you know what, the Israelites, they only want my signs and wonders. They only want my power, they don't want my presence. He sees right through their motives. But the Samaritans, who Jesus visited on his way to Cana, the Samaritans are different. You see, in Samaria, Jesus doesn't do a single miracle. All he does is talk and be present with the people. And they come to believe. They come to believe that he is the Messiah, and they beg him to stay with them. And John has to say, after Jesus stayed with them for 2 days, he went up to Galilee. And here's the thing, you know, oftentimes on this greater life journey that we are on, this greater than journey that Jesus invites us into, we sometimes get confused with what we are seeking. You see, sometimes we get confused and we get enamored with his power, and we forget about his presence. And when we look at the New Testament, what we see happening in the New Testament is that when Jesus encounters a group of people and they become enamored with his power but aren't interested in his presence, do you know what he does? He withdraws. He withdraws the very thing that they need, his presence. You see, when you seek his power, you miss his presence. When you are seeking his power more than anything else, you miss his presence. But when you seek his presence, that is when his power is truly revealed. And too often, We are more enamored on this greater life, greater than journey that we are on. We are too enamored with his power, with the signs and the wonders that could happen, than we are with actually being in his presence. And we miss his presence. Think of it like this. You know, you've probably had some friends who were more enamored with what you could do for them than with you being there, right? I used to work in information technology, and I was decent enough at what I did. Means I could fix computers from time to time, right? And I had some friends who, they never invited me over to their house unless their computer was broken, right? Anybody got a friend like that? When your car's broken, they are your best friends, right? But when your car is running great, not so much. And I had some friends like that in information technology. They would invite me to their house whenever their computer was broken. I was their best friend whenever they were looking to buy a new computer, whenever they needed advice about what was going on. I was their best friend because they were more interested in what I could do for them than in being with me and knowing me. And friends, we need to be careful. On this greater than journey that we are on, we need to be careful that we seek his face, not his hands. We seek his face and we want his presence. We seek his hands, we're just interested in what he can do for us. Tell me, as you have sought after God, have you been more enamored with his power, with what he can do for you, or than with his presence? Sometimes I think we treat Jesus like he is the cure for all that ails us. Do this, Jesus, I need this, I need this, I need this, I need this. Friends, Jesus came not for the signs and the wonders. He came to be present with you and me in our life. All of the rest is just the benefits of being friends with him. You see, the miraculous is only a means to know the Messiah. It is not the meat of the gospel. It is only the means of being introduced to the Messiah. And the Israelites, Jerusalem, Judea, Galilee, they were more interested in the miracles than with the Messiah. What are you interested in today? You see, the path to the greater than is all about presence. On the path to the greater than, the power of Jesus is just a waypoint. It's just a waypoint along the journey. It's not the destination. The destination is always the presence of Jesus. Jesus asks this question, and it sounds to us a lot like a rebuke, and to the crowd it is, but to the man it's actually a challenge, or it's a question to search what's going on deep within your soul. To say, what is the real thing that I'm searching for? Is it presence or is it power? And the man responds, and he says this, "Sir, come down before my child dies." The man, remember, Capernaum is 900 feet below where they are right now. That's why he says, "Come down before my son dies." Make the journey with me, to be at my son's side so that he can die in your presence. You know, there's other accounts in the New Testament where people come to Jesus and they're coming because their child is sick, or their servant is sick, or somebody that they care about deeply is sick. And Jesus sees them and they ask Jesus for what they want. And they always ask him to heal their child, to heal their servant. They ask for that. You know, whenever somebody comes to Jesus, they ask for healing, but this man says, "Come down and be with my son before he dies." You see, the man has realized it's about the presence, not the power. And he doesn't know what's going to happen to his son, but he knows this: I want my son to be in the presence of Jesus, whatever happens. And sometimes I think in life, we don't care about the presence. We care about the power. And the man looks inside himself, and he searches and he realizes, I want Jesus to be present with my son. And he persists. He doesn't give up when Jesus asks a challenging question. I think sometimes, you know, on this journey to the greater than, I think sometimes we miss out on what Jesus has for us because we don't persist. Because Jesus says something that challenges us, that makes us search our soul, and we don't do the hard work of seeing what's going on within us. to evaluating what Jesus said. Instead, we just give up. Say, it's not for me. We have to be like this father who persisted, who did the hard work of saying, okay, here's what's going on within me. And it's not the power that I want. I just want to be in the presence, because there's something about the presence of Jesus that is just attractive. And it's what we really need, ultimately. All of Scripture is about us discovering life in the presence of God. It starts out in Genesis 1, and God creates this beautiful place where we can live in His presence all along, but we rebel against Him. We turn away from Him. And the story moving up to the book of Revelation, the revelation of Jesus Christ, the story is of how God helps us encounter His presence again and live in His presence, so that Revelation ends where we live in His presence, because everything else is just secondary to life in the presence of God. And this is the greater than life. And sometimes we give up too easy, too quickly. We do not persist like this man did, who spent a whole day of his life searching out the presence of Jesus, who did the hard work of seeing what was in his soul and just asking for Jesus to be present when his son dies. What do you need to persist in? What do you need to keep seeking Him? Imagine if the man had given up when Jesus said, unless you see signs and wonders, you'll never believe. Imagine if he just kind of walked away at that point. He was this close, but he turns away. What do you need to persist at today and seek His presence more than His power? The royal official said, "Sir, come down before my child dies." And Jesus replies, "Go, your son will live. Go, your son will live." And it says this: the man took Jesus at His word. The man took Jesus at His word, and he departed. Put yourself in this man's shoes or his sandals. Imagine your son is dying in Capernaum. You've walked a whole day's journey uphill to be in the presence of Jesus. And Jesus says, just go. Your son's healed. You have no proof. We often read the accounts of Jesus' life and we know the ending, right? We know what happens. We know Jesus dies and resurrected, ascended into heaven. We know all things are possible in Him. But this man doesn't know that. He doesn't know the ending. All he knows is that there's this guy who had done some pretty crazy things, some pretty amazing things in Jerusalem. And so he's desperate. And so he's going to walk uphill a whole day just to be in Jesus' presence. And he speaks 2 sentences to Jesus. And Jesus says, "Go, it's done." Would you go? Would you do what Jesus said? Would you take Jesus at His word? I don't know that I would. I don't know that I would. There's no proof. There's no evidence. If Jesus is wrong, it's a whole day to find out that He's wrong. Wouldn't you try to just drag Him there? I think sometimes we miss out on the greater than that Jesus has for us because we won't take Jesus at His word. We don't trust Him. We think, well, that can't be true. That can't be what He really means. Or we don't trust Him. I don't think He really cares for us on that level. I don't think He wants to help us in that way. And I don't think we take Jesus at His word. You know, on that, when we were in Phoenix, my wife arranges these hikes. And, you know, like I said already, it's not kind of my thing. And yet Britton says, "You'll like it. Come, it'll be fun." I'm like, oh, can't we just stay? I mean, my idea for the vacation was read books, eat, watch movies, eat, sleep, eat. There's a theme, isn't there? You don't get to be my size without trying. Come on. But that was my idea. But Britton says, "No, come, this will be fun." Oh. And then she says, "Let's drive 3+ hours up to the Grand Canyon." Really? I mean, we got potholes in Saskatchewan. What's the difference? It's a hole in the ground. Who cares? Right? But she said, you'll enjoy it. We should do it. And I took her at her word. And I discovered heights that I'd never been at before, views that I'd never seen before. I saw the glory of God in a way I'd never seen it before because I trusted her and took her at her word. And sometimes we don't trust Jesus. Oh, we say, I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to you, but I don't really trust you. And that's part of the reason why we struggle with John 14:12, because we don't really believe and trust that he said is really true. But sometimes it's because we give up on trusting too quickly. And, I talked about how, this greater than life, that the path is marked with persistence, but it's also marked with trust. And sometimes we have to persistently trust. Oh, that sucks, right? Persistently trust. Because we trust, but then we get so far and it's just not happening, so we give up, and we just need to persist in trusting. When we first went on our hikes, the first hike we went to was a path called Telegraph Trail. And the first half mile was really boring. It was flat. It was like nothing to look at. It was just like, I wanted to go back to the hotel. I wanted to go watch a movie. I wanted to do anything else but be there on that trail. But I had to persistently trust my wife that this would be fun, that it would be worth it in the end. And friends, the last half mile was amazing. But if I'd given up in that first half mile, I would have never seen it. Do you have to persistently trust? What is it that you need to persistently trust with? Because the path to the greater than is marked with persistence. The path to the greater than is marked with trust. Where do you need to trust God today? Where do you need to take Jesus at his word? The man takes Jesus at his word, and John tells us that he departed. And while he was still on his way home, his servant met him with the news that his boy was living. And when he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said, yesterday at 1 p.m, the fever left him. I wonder how often we miss out on the things of God, the things that God is doing all around us, because we're just not paying attention. Because we forgot that we asked for something. Because we're just not satisfied with what he is doing, and we want something more than that. This father has this presence of mind to say, when he finds out that his son is alive, he says, when did this happen? Oh, at 1 o'clock yesterday. And he realizes, he connects the dot. That was when Jesus said that my son would live. I wonder how many times you've missed what God did in your life. I wonder how many times you missed the greater than because we just weren't paying attention. Because we wanted something else, right? Have you ever done that? It's like, Jesus, I want this, but he gives you this, right? It's like, I didn't ask for that, but there's no return slip, right? And I wonder how many times we miss out because we just aren't looking for what Jesus is doing for us. What if the man had stayed there with Jesus and said, no, Jesus, that's fine, I'm not leaving without you, right? The man wanted his son to live, but he asked for Jesus to come. What if he just stuck with what he'd asked Jesus to do? What would we miss out on because we aren't watching? We need to walk through this world, through our lives, through every day, looking for where Jesus is, not looking for where we want Jesus to be. Because where Jesus is, that's where the greater than life is found. What are you missing? Where is Jesus that you're not looking? When he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said yesterday at noon, 1 p.m. And then the father realized that this was the exact time at which Jesus had said, your son will live. So he and his whole household believed. He realizes this was when Jesus said his son would live. And we read that last part, so he and his whole household believed. And I think sometimes we read that part and we think North American household, mom, dad, 2.5 kids, a dog, a cat, all of that, right? But that's not what John is describing. In the first century, a household was much larger. A household was at least 40 people, more likely 70 people, and because this is a royal official, it could be even larger than that. This was everybody that a mom, dad, all of the kids, grandparents, maybe grandkids, aunt, uncle, Uncle Sue's girlfriend, all of those sort of things, right? Yeah, you like that? I kind of messed up the names there. It's not an agenda, don't worry. It's just a slip of the tongue. But that's a household. Much bigger, 40 to 70 people. Imagine one man experiences the presence of God. One boy is healed. And 70 people recognize who Jesus really is. That's the power of God. But see, the power is just the means to meet the Messiah. And the power of God should always lead you into the presence of God. But sometimes we're just satisfied, looking for that power. And we need to pursue his presence. But there's something else there's an important truth from what we read here. Is that, when we experience the presence of God, it's not just for you. It's not just for you. It's meant to be shared. The man shares the story. He realizes that this was the moment when Jesus healed his son. And he shares that with his whole household. That's why the household comes to believe. And you see, when you experience the presence of God, it fills you up. And the measure of fullness is overflowing. The measure of fullness is not just having something in it. It's overflowing onto everyone around you. And we pursue his presence. And his presence overflows in our life onto everyone around us. The problem is that too often we either don't notice what he's doing, or when we notice what he's doing, we keep it to ourselves and we don't tell anybody. And friends, the pathway to the greater than is marked with sharing. It is sharing your experiences. Why? Because when that happens, when we realize how God showed up for you and for me, and when we share that together, it creates a hunger within us for more of his presence, for more of what he's going to do, whatever that may be. The presence is what you seek, not his power. The presence is what you share. And sometimes in the midst of being filled with his Spirit, you get to share something else. You get to share his power as it's poured out into the other people around you. But it's never forget that it's about his presence, not about his power. And when you have that privilege and that moment where Jesus pours his power through you into the life of someone else, always be sure to point that back to the glory of God. Next week, we're going to look at a story where Jesus is challenged, and they say, well, who told you could do that? And Jesus says, you know what, my Father is working, and so am I. And Jesus reveals the power of God, but he always gives God the glory. Why? Because it's about the presence, not about the power. And when we don't give God the glory, we make it about the power and about us. And so we need to share both what God is doing in our life, but we also need to be open to letting God use us in the lives of the people around us, to share what he is doing, to share the presence in their life, to bring the presence into downtown Regina, into your office tower, to bring the presence into the General Hospital, the Pasqua Hospital, to bring the presence into the classroom, to bring the presence into the T.C. Douglas building, to bring the presence into your daycare, to bring the presence into Superstore. We always need to be mindful that the greater than life is a life lived in the presence of God, and we take that presence wherever we go. And friends, when you walk out this door and you get in your car and you go to your restaurant or you go to your house, be mindful that when you sit down at that table, that you are the presence of God in that room. And what is it that God wants you to do with his presence in that room? As you walk through the week, as you sit in meetings, how are you being the presence of God to that person? Sometimes you're going to mess up. Just it is. But then you just get right back up and you be the presence of God again. This is the greater than life that we're invited into. To take his presence everywhere we go, to persist, to trust, to share. And we experience his presence, and his presence is poured out on the people around us, and we just might see signs and wonders. Actually, scratch that. We will see signs and wonders as we seek his presence first and bring his presence into every avenue and every street and every place we go. What do you need to do? What do you need to do today? The greater than life is a life lived in his presence. Are you seeking his presence? Are you seeking his presence above all else? Maybe you need to persist. Maybe there's something today that you've just been disappointed at, and you're ready to give up. You're ready to just let go. This is done. I'm out of here. And you just need to persist. Keep going. Keep pursuing. There's more of his presence. He wants more for you today. Or maybe you just need to trust. Maybe you've heard already what Jesus has for you. You know what he wants you to do, but you're just not willing to do it because you just can't trust that he is actually right, that he actually cares about you, that he actually wants something good for you. You feel like if you do that thing, it's going to rob you of something else. And friend, Jesus just wants you to trust. And it's the marker to the greater than that he's inviting you to experience. Or maybe today, it's time to start sharing. Maybe this last week, as I invited you on this greater than challenge of walking through the day and looking for opportunities to experience the greater than, maybe you've had some stories that have come up. Maybe some things have happened and you've just kind of kept them to yourself because you're scared of what people might think about you. You're scared of what might happen if you shared it. And maybe it's time to share. Or maybe you've tried to step into the greater than life and you heard the Spirit whisper that I want you to do this or I want you to say this to that person and you just held back, and maybe it's time to start sharing the presence that you have in the place where he's put you. What is it that you need to do? The greater than life is a life lived in his presence, where we experience more and more and more of his presence, and his power is revealed along the way. But it's always about his power. It's always about his presence, not his power. What are you seeking today?